It was July 5th, 2012, when Jonathan Crupi called 911, but what he didn't know was that his life was about to unravel in front of him, revealing a deadly secret. "I just came home. My wife is dead," he calmly uttered into the phone. "Oh my God, I think my house was robbed." But what lay behind his words? Who could have murdered Simeonette Mapes Crupi in such a violent way? And why did her husband, Jonathan, seem so calm, so collected in the face of such a tragedy? Was this truly the aftermath of a burglary gone wrong, or was something far darker unfolding? What was Jonathan Crupi hiding? The answers to these questions would soon come to light, revealing a twisted tale of deception, betrayal, and murder. Simeonette Mapes Crupi was a woman who lived with a fervor for life, a passion for teaching, and a love for those closest to her. To those who knew her, she was more than just a daughter, a sister, or a wife. She was a vibrant spirit, full of laughter, energy, and dreams. At 29 years old, she had already accomplished much, but the promise of even greater things loomed ahead. She had a love for music that infused every moment of her life, her feet forever moving to the rhythm of a song, and her heart forever eager to share that joy with those around her. To her family and friends, she was the type of person who lit up every room she entered, and her infectious laugh was a sound that would echo in their memories long after she was gone. Born and raised in Staten Island, New York, Simeonette was always close to her family. She shared an especially tight bond with her father, John Mapes Jr., who remembers her with deep fondness. "She loved life. She loved to have fun," he would later recall. It was this exuberance for life that made her death all the more unfathomable. Little did anyone know, she was just days away from celebrating her 5th wedding anniversary when her life would be tragically cut short. Simeonette's career as a teacher reflected her devotion to others. She worked at the School for Classics in Brooklyn, a place where she inspired and shaped young minds. It was in her work that she found a deeper sense of purpose. Along with her husband, Jonathan Crupi, she was invested in furthering her education, working towards a master's degree at the College of Staten Island. Both shared a dream of advancing their careers and improving their future, with hopes of making a lasting impact on the lives of the students they taught. Simeonette, ever the idealist, had a particular soft spot for those who struggled to find their place in the world. Her compassion knew no bounds, and it was clear to anyone who knew her that she cared deeply about her students' well-being. It was in the quiet suburbs of New Springville, Staten Island, that Simeonette and Jonathan lived. Their home, a modest yet comfortable residence, stood as a representation of their shared life and the dreams they held. The neighborhood, though typically peaceful and uneventful, would soon become the setting for a tragedy that would unravel a web of lies, deceit, and betrayal. The evening of July 5th, 2012, began like any other, with the sun hanging low over the horizon and the faint hum of summer filling the air. The Crupi household, however, would soon be thrust into chaos. Jonathan Crupi, at 30 years old, was the first to return home that day. It was his voice that would ring through the 911 dispatcher's line in the hours that followed. The calmness in his voice belied the gravity of the situation, yet it was a calmness that would raise questions later. "I just came home. My wife is dead," Jonathan said. His words, though shocking, were filled with a chilling lack of emotion, a stark contrast to the horror of the crime scene that would soon be uncovered. As emergency services rushed to the scene, a feeling of unease began to settle over the neighborhood. The once quiet streets of New Springville now buzzed with activity as officers swarmed the Crupi residence, their radios crackling with urgency. They would soon find that the house, once a home filled with the promise of a bright future, had become the scene of a violent, senseless crime. The first responders were met with a scene of devastation. Simeonette Mapes Crupi lay lifeless at the bottom of the stairs, her body battered and broken. She had been pushed down the flight of stairs in a violent act of rage, then brutally stabbed 15 times. The evidence of her violent death was undeniable. There was nothing peaceful about it. The very air in the house seemed to tremble with the violence that had transpired within its walls. As investigators stepped into the Crupi residence, the scene before them seemed to be one of chaos. The house had been ransacked. Items were scattered across the floors, drawers pulled open, and belongings tossed about in what appeared to be a hasty search for valuables. The destruction was unmistakable. At first glance, it seemed clear. This had all the hallmarks of a burglary gone wrong. The kind of violent crime that sometimes occurs when an intruder is surprised by a victim, and things escalate quickly. But as the detectives examined the home more closely, they began to notice something odd, something that didn't quite fit with the narrative of a robbery. The valuables, normally the first things to be taken in such a crime, were all still present. Credit cards, cash, checks, items that would typically be grabbed in a hurry, lay untouched on countertops. A diamond engagement ring was left resting on the bathroom sink, as though it had been carefully placed there. If this was a robbery, then why had the thief left behind such tempting prizes? Why had nothing of value been taken? This discrepancy raised immediate concerns for Detective Michael Cosenza and his team. Their instincts told them that something wasn't quite right. The crime scene looked too orchestrated, too carefully staged. It felt as though someone had gone to great lengths to create the illusion of a burglary, to mislead investigators into thinking this was a simple case of a robbery gone wrong. But as the detectives continued to comb through the scene, their suspicions began to grow. The back door, a sliding glass door that led to the backyard, had been left ajar. This could have been the entry point for the supposed intruder. But there was no sign of forced entry, no signs of a struggle at the door. It was as though the perpetrator had been let in, or had entered without resistance. This strange detail was noted by the detectives, and the door's handle was carefully processed for any trace evidence. What they didn't know at that moment was that this seemingly insignificant detail would soon hold the key to unraveling the mystery. And then there was the 911 call, which had been placed by Jonathan Crupi himself. When officers listened to the recording of his call, they couldn't help but be struck by his reaction, or lack of it. His words were calm, almost unnervingly so, given the horrific nature of the crime he was describing. "I just came home. My wife is dead," Crupi said, his voice steady and composed. "Oh my God, I think my house was robbed." There was something about the way he spoke that raised red flags. His voice lacked the kind of frantic urgency one would expect from someone who had just discovered their spouse's brutal murder. Instead, it was eerily calm, detached even. Crupi's words seemed rehearsed, his shock almost too controlled. To the trained ears of the investigators, it was as though Crupi was more concerned with maintaining a composed exterior than with showing the genuine emotion that such a discovery would naturally provoke. This strange tone of indifference in the call would become the first of many warning signs that suggested Jonathan Crupi was not the victim he appeared to be. But the investigation was still in its early stages, and there were many questions that remained unanswered. Why did Jonathan Crupi's behavior seem so off? Was he simply in shock, or was there something more to his reaction? And if this wasn't a robbery as it appeared, then who could have wanted to kill Simeonette Mappus Crupi? The detectives were determined to find out. The more the investigators learned about the couple's life, the more they realized there was much they didn't know. On the surface, Jonathan and Simeonette appeared to be a happy couple, two individuals working hard to build their futures. They both taught at the School for Classics in Brooklyn and had been working towards earning master's degrees to further their careers. They had only 2 days left before their 5th wedding anniversary. On the surface, they seemed like an ordinary couple, with ordinary hopes and dreams. But now, in the wake of Simeonette's tragic death, a different story began to emerge. Investigators began to dig into Jonathan Crupi's movements on the day of the murder, retracing his steps and trying to corroborate his account of events. According to Crupi, he had left the house at 7:30 a.m. that morning, and from there, he had gone on a series of errands. He claimed he had had his car inspected, gone to the school to pick up supplies, shopped for sneakers, and then made a stop at Home Depot. His story seemed plausible at first, but when detectives began to verify his alibi, they uncovered inconsistencies that would cast doubt on his version of events. Surveillance footage from the school where Jonathan worked confirmed that he had indeed arrived there and spent some time in the building. a receipt for the car inspection was found, listing the time and mileage of the vehicle. However, when detectives reviewed the security footage from the Home Depot in the Charleston area of Staten Island, they found something troubling. Jonathan Crupi had never entered the store. This was the moment when suspicions began to solidify. Crupi's story wasn't adding up. If he hadn't gone to Home Depot as he claimed, then where had he been? What had he been doing in the hours leading up to his wife's death? The lies were mounting, and with each one, the image of Jonathan Crupi as the grieving husband began to crumble. The mystery deepened further when investigators learned about an unusual detail at the crime scene. Despite Crupi's insistence that the rear sliding glass door had been locked when he left that morning, it had been left open upon his return. This seemingly minor detail would later prove to be significant, but at that moment, investigators had to wonder, had Crupi been involved in some way? Had he staged the crime to look like a robbery? As the investigation unfolded, one thing became clear. The detectives were dealing with a man whose actions and words didn't match the gravity of the situation. Jonathan Crupi's calmness, his lies, and the strange inconsistencies in his story pointed to the unsettling possibility that he knew more about his wife's death than he was letting on. With each new lead, the investigation grew darker. The detectives knew they were getting closer, but they also knew that the true motive for the crime remained elusive, and so they pressed on, determined to uncover the truth behind the brutal murder of Simeonette Crupi. As the investigation dug deeper into the details of Crupi's life and his relationship with his wife, the detectives began to uncover unsettling evidence. Simeonette Crupi had not been the only one with secrets. Jonathan Crupi's actions, his lies, and his inability to account for his whereabouts on that fateful day raised suspicions. But it wasn't just his lies that were starting to raise red flags. New evidence would soon come to light that would shift the investigation in an unexpected direction. The key piece of evidence that would change everything came in the form of DNA. As part of the investigation, the police had meticulously processed the crime scene, collecting DNA samples from the various surfaces that may have been touched during the attack. The rear sliding glass door, which had been left ajar, was one of the areas examined. It had been a critical point of entry, either for the perpetrator or someone involved in staging the crime. The door handle, where the killer's fingerprints or DNA might have been left, was tested for evidence. When the results of the DNA tests came back, they revealed an unexpected twist. Jonathan Crupi's DNA was found on the door handle, but there was more. Alongside his DNA, a woman's DNA was also discovered, DNA that did not belong to Simeonette Crupi. The presence of this unknown woman's DNA at the crime scene was a startling revelation. It was the first direct indication that someone else, someone entirely unrelated to the victim, had been in the house. And yet, the detectives were puzzled. Who was this woman? What connection did she have to the crime? The discovery of the mystery woman's DNA would become a key turning point in the investigation. At first, the detectives struggled to make sense of it. The DNA didn't match any of the known suspects, nor did it belong to any family member or friend of the victim. It was a mystery that only deepened as the investigation continued. But there was one critical clue that pointed to an unsettling possibility: Jonathan Crupi's involvement with this woman. As the detectives continued to dig into Crupi's life, they uncovered disturbing information about his personal relationships. Crupi had been having an affair with a sex worker known only as Miss Pumpkin. It was an affair that had been going on for several months, and one that Simeonette had likely been aware of. In fact, detectives soon learned that just days before her death, Simeonette had discovered that her husband had not attended the college classes she had paid for, and had instead been spending money on his extramarital affairs. As the pieces of the puzzle began to fall into place, the presence of Miss Pumpkin's DNA at the crime scene began to make sense. Miss Pumpkin, whose real name was never publicly revealed, had been with Crupi on the day of the murder. Her DNA on the door handle was a direct link between her and the crime scene. She had been there, in the house, on the same day that Simeonette had been killed. But the question remained, was Miss Pumpkin involved in the murder, Or was her DNA simply a result of her being in the house with Crupi at some point before the crime was committed? The answer to that question would soon come, but for now, the investigation was left with more questions than answers. The detectives had learned that Crupi's lies were not just isolated incidents. They were part of a larger pattern of deception that had been ongoing for some time. And now, with the discovery of Miss Pumpkin's DNA, it seemed as though Crupi's life was starting to unravel. The perfect facade he had built was beginning to crack, revealing a far more complex and disturbing reality. The investigation had reached a critical juncture. The pieces were starting to fall into place, but there was still so much left to uncover. What had led to Simeonette's tragic death? Was Jonathan Crupi the orchestrator of this violent crime, or had someone else been involved? The answers were slowly emerging, but the full truth remained elusive. In the meantime, the detectives pressed on, determined to uncover the identity of the mysterious woman whose DNA had been found at the scene. As they pieced together the final clues, the shocking truth about Jonathan Crupi's involvement in his wife's murder would soon come to light. The investigation was far from over, and the story was about to take an even darker turn. The detectives soon learned that on the day of Simeonette's murder, Miss Pumpkin had been in contact with Jonathan. At 12:45 p.m., the same time that Jonathan claimed to have gone to Home Depot, he had called Miss Pumpkin to arrange a meeting. It was a call that would become the centerpiece of the investigation, revealing not only Jonathan's infidelity, but the timing of his movements on the fateful day his wife was murdered. Miss Pumpkin, when interviewed by investigators, confirmed the details of the phone call. She had met with Jonathan, as he had requested. And as the interview continued, it became clear that Miss Pumpkin had more to reveal than anyone could have anticipated. She recounted the affair in chilling detail, painting a picture of a man who had lived a double life, one that had been hidden from his wife and those closest to him. Her testimony was a bombshell, shattering the image of Jonathan Crupi as the grieving husband. Instead, she painted a picture of a man who had spent the day of his wife's death not in mourning, but in the midst of his own desires, caught up in an affair that he had kept secret from everyone, including the woman he had promised to love. As Miss Pumpkin spoke, the detectives began to piece together the timeline of events leading up to the murder. Jonathan's movements, as described by both the security footage and the woman herself, painted a stark contrast to the story he had told the police. While he had claimed to be running errands and minding his business, the reality of the day was something far different. He had spent his time engaged in activities that had no place in a man's life who claimed to be devastated by the loss of his wife. But Miss Pumpkin's revelation didn't stop there. As investigators pressed her further, they learned that the affair had not been a secret to Simeonette. She had known about Jonathan's infidelity, and the tension that had been building in their marriage had been the result of her growing awareness of his betrayal. In the weeks leading up to her death, Simeonette had searched for information on marriage counseling and in vitro fertilization, suggesting that she had been considering ways to salvage the relationship. But it was clear that the betrayal had taken a heavy toll on her. She was no longer willing to turn a blind eye to Jonathan's actions. It seemed as though the cracks in their marriage were impossible to repair, and that knowledge would only heighten the rage and resentment Jonathan had been harboring. His lies, his deceit, and his betrayal had shattered the foundation of their relationship, and in a moment of anger and despair, he had taken matters into his own hands. The crime scene, with its chaotic and violent aftermath, was the culmination of months of built-up tension. Miss Pumpkin's testimony was the final piece of the puzzle, confirming what investigators had suspected all along. Jonathan Crupi had been living a life of lies and deception, and he had resorted to violence to cover his tracks. The affair, his betrayal, and his lies were all intertwined in a tragic story that would lead to the brutal murder of his wife. As the investigation continued to unfold, the web of deception grew ever more complex. Jonathan's actions, fueled by his secrets and his infidelity, had led him down a path that would ultimately bring him face to face with the consequences of his choices. And while Miss Pumpkin's testimony had been the key to unraveling the mystery of Simeonette Mapes Crupi's death, it was clear that the story was far from over. The investigation was far from finished, and the full truth of what happened that fateful day was still yet to be fully revealed. As the investigation into the brutal murder of Simeonette Mapes Crupi continued, the detectives unearthed even more disturbing evidence that would solidify their suspicions and push them ever closer to the truth. What had once appeared to be an isolated crime, a tragic accident within a marriage, began to reveal itself as something far more deliberate, a calculated and cold act of violence. Detective Michael Cosenza and his team, already questioning Jonathan Crupi's increasingly inconsistent statements, turned their attention to the technological footprint left behind by the suspect. It was during a search of the couple's home that the detectives made a startling discovery: a throwaway phone hidden within a coat pocket. The phone, discarded and seemingly inconspicuous, would turn out to be a critical piece of evidence. It wasn't just any phone. It was one that had been used for specific purposes, a way for Jonathan to keep his extramarital affairs and his darkest secrets out of reach. This phone was linked to his communications with Miss Pumpkin and others involved in his double life. But the throwaway phone wasn't the only discovery that would propel the investigation forward. Detectives soon turned their focus to Jonathan's online activity, digging into his search history to find more clues. What they found sent chills down their spines. For months, Jonathan had been searching for topics related to murder and violence, searching for ways to commit the perfect crime. His Google search history was a haunting trail of chilling queries that spoke volumes about his state of mind in the weeks leading up to his wife's murder. How to clean up a crime scene, best ways to suffocate someone, how to cut a throat. These were not the searches of someone grieving or in shock. These were the searches of someone planning, someone who had spent months preparing for a crime. Each search revealed more about Jonathan's growing obsession with death, with violence, and with the means to carry out his horrific plan. It became clear that his thoughts were no longer on his wife or their future together, but on his secret life, his betrayal, and the steps he was willing to take to escape the consequences. The realization that Jonathan Crupi had been planning his wife's murder for months was a staggering one. His search history alone painted a chilling portrait of a man who had carefully orchestrated the violent end of the woman he had once vowed to love and cherish. Simeonette, who had been so devoted to their marriage and their shared dreams, had no idea that her husband was preparing to take everything from her in a most brutal and cold-blooded way. As the investigators processed this unsettling information, they turned their attention to the murder weapon, another crucial piece of the puzzle. A thorough search of the couple's home led to the discovery of a knife, hidden in plain sight, but placed in such a way that it might have been overlooked by someone without the proper focus. It was a simple kitchen knife, but its role in the crime could not have been clearer. Bloodstains on the blade matched Simeonette's DNA, and it was found near the scene of the crime. It was clear now the murder weapon had been in the home the entire time, lying in wait, just as Jonathan's plan had been. The discovery of the knife and the disturbing online searches were the final pieces of the puzzle that investigators had been painstakingly trying to put together. With these findings in hand, it became impossible to deny the conclusion that had been forming since the beginning of the investigation. Jonathan Crupi was the killer. He was the only one who could have committed this brutal crime. For weeks, detectives had been working to establish the truth, to connect the dots that would point them toward the murderer. At first, Crupi's calm demeanor and seemingly innocent behavior had raised few red flags, but as the investigation progressed, the cracks in his alibi and the lies he had told began to mount. From the inexplicable absence at Home Depot to the throwaway phone, from the disturbing online searches to the discovery of the murder weapon, it became clear that Jonathan had carefully plotted his wife's death in cold blood. Jonathan Crupi had tried to mask his involvement with lies, deception, and manipulation, but the evidence against him was undeniable. He had carefully staged the scene, trying to make it appear as though his wife's death had been the result of a random burglary gone wrong. Yet, no matter how hard he tried to weave his web of deceit, the truth always found its way to the surface. His DNA at the scene, the strange lack of forced entry, the untouched valuables, all of it pointed back to him. The final blow to Crupi's defense came in the form of his own actions, documented both online and through the phone records. His search for murder methods, his premeditated plans, and the evidence linking him directly to the crime scene made it clear that his story was nothing more than a fabrication. No longer could he hide behind the facade of the grieving husband. His lies had been exposed for what they were, desperate attempts to avoid responsibility for his actions. Jonathan's behavior leading up to and after the murder only added to the mounting evidence. The 911 call, which had seemed so innocent at first, now seemed more like a carefully rehearsed performance. His calmness, his attempt to direct attention away from himself, his deliberate omission of important details, all of it painted a clear picture of a man who had been planning this moment for a long time. His cool demeanor was not the reaction of a shocked husband, but rather of someone who knew exactly what they were doing. The investigation had taken many unexpected twists and turns, but in the end the evidence was irrefutable. Jonathan Crupi, once seen as the innocent husband and teacher, was revealed to be a cold-blooded killer. The picture of a devoted spouse had been shattered, replaced by a man driven by lies, infidelity, and an overwhelming desire to cover up his dark secrets. His actions had cost Simeonette Crupi her life, and for that, he would be held accountable. As the investigation drew to a close, the detectives could only reflect on the tragic outcome of a marriage that had been built on lies, betrayal, and ultimately violence. Simeonette's family, who had once hoped for a peaceful resolution, were left to grapple with the devastating truth. Jonathan Crupi, now a convicted murderer, would face the consequences of his actions. And though justice had been served, it did little to ease the pain and loss felt by those who had known and loved Simeonette. The story of her life, once full of promise and hope, would be remembered not for the tragedy that ended it, but for the love and joy she brought to those who were fortunate enough to know her. As the investigation into the brutal murder of Simeonette Crupi reached its final stages, a sense of anticipation and tension hung in the air. For months, the detectives had meticulously pieced together a complex puzzle, each new discovery pushing them closer to the truth. Jonathan Crupi, once seen as the grieving husband, had been unmasked as the cold, calculating murderer he truly was. The lies he had spun, the inconsistencies in his story, and the damning evidence that had slowly surfaced all pointed to one undeniable conclusion. He was responsible for the death of the woman he had once promised to love and cherish. The final pieces of the investigation were falling into place. From the chilling Google searches that indicated premeditation, to the discovery of the throwaway phone that linked him to the murder, to the DNA found at the crime scene, every lead had pointed back to Crupi. His attempt to stage the crime as a robbery gone wrong had failed miserably, and his lies had crumbled under the weight of the evidence. The detectives had been relentless in their pursuit of justice, and now the moment they had been working towards for so long was finally within reach. The decision was made. Jonathan Crupi was going to be arrested. But as the officers gathered outside his parents' house in Brooklyn, preparing for the moment that would end months of painstaking investigation, there was still an undeniable sense of disbelief. How could this man, the man who had once seemed so ordinary, so caring, have committed such a heinous act? How could he have murdered the woman he had vowed to spend his life with? The questions lingered in the air, unanswered, as the detectives prepared to confront Crupi with the truth. It was November 2012 when Jonathan Crupi's world began to unravel in a way he could never have anticipated. The police arrived at his parents' house, the location where he had been staying since his wife's death. Officers surrounded the house, knowing that they had the evidence they needed to arrest him. There was no turning back now. As they entered the home, the tension in the air was palpable. Crupi, who had spent months deceiving everyone around him, would finally be confronted with the overwhelming evidence of his guilt. When the police arrived at the door, Jonathan Crupi was taken by surprise. Though he had been carefully avoiding arrest up until that point, the weight of the investigation had finally caught up with him. He was arrested without incident and charged with the second-degree murder of his wife, Simeonette Crupi. The arrest was the culmination of months of hard work, a relentless pursuit of justice, and the unraveling of a man's lies and betrayal. Yet as Crupi was led away in handcuffs, the question remained, how could a man who had once appeared so devoted to his wife and their shared dreams have been capable of such violence? The answer, as it had become so clear over the course of the investigation, lay in the details. The lies, the infidelity, and the cold, calculated manner in which Jonathan Crupi had planned his wife's death. Simeonette, who had loved and trusted him, had never known the full extent of the man she had married. She had been blinded by her love for him, unable to see the cracks in their relationship until it was too late. The evidence, his lies about his alibi, the disturbing online searches, the throwaway phone, and the DNA evidence, painted a stark portrait of a man driven by anger, betrayal, and a willingness to do anything to cover up his own sins. The detectives had spent countless hours reviewing evidence, retracing Crupi's movements, and interviewing witnesses. They had slowly and methodically built a case that left no room for doubt. By the time the arrest was made, there was no question that Jonathan Crupi was the one responsible for Simeonette's brutal murder. His attempts to cover his tracks had failed. The evidence spoke for itself. As the arrest unfolded, the detectives took a moment to reflect on the journey that had led them to this point. The investigation had begun with a simple 911 call from Jonathan Crupi, a call that seemed innocuous at first. But as they dug deeper into his life, they had uncovered a web of deceit and betrayal that ultimately led to his downfall. The lies he had told, the inconsistencies in his story, and the mounting evidence all pointed to one undeniable truth. Jonathan Crupi had murdered his wife. The arrest marked the beginning of the end for Jonathan Crupi. As he was taken into custody, he would have to confront the consequences of his actions. His life, once filled with the promise of a bright future, had come crashing down. The family he had destroyed, the trust he had shattered, and the life he had taken, all of it would weigh heavily on him as he faced trial for his crime. For Simeonette's family and friends, the arrest was bittersweet. While they had long suspected that Jonathan was responsible for her death, the truth had been hard to accept. Simeonette's father, John Mapes Jr., had been devastated by the loss of his daughter, the woman he had known to be full of life and love. To know that the man she had trusted, the man who had promised to care for her, had been the one to take her life, was a cruel blow. In the months that followed, as Jonathan Crupi awaited trial, the investigation continued to be a point of reflection for those who had been involved. The case had been one of lies and betrayal, but it was also a case of a family torn apart by violence. For Simeonette's family, there would be no closure, only the pain of knowing that she had been taken from them far too soon. But justice, they hoped, would prevail. Jonathan Crupi had been arrested, and though it could never bring Simeonette back, it was a small step toward accountability for the crime he had committed. The road ahead was uncertain, but for now, the detectives knew they had done everything they could to bring the truth to light. Jonathan Crupi was no longer the man he had once appeared to be. The mask had fallen, and the world could see him for what he truly was, the man who had murdered the woman he once promised to love. The trial of Jonathan Crupi for the murder of his wife, Simeonette Crupi, was a harrowing chapter in the aftermath of a crime that had shaken not only a family, but an entire community. By the time the case reached the courtroom, the truth was clear, and the evidence against Crupi was overwhelming. It had been a long and grueling journey for investigators, but they had pieced together every detail, from the lies Jonathan had told to the disturbing evidence that had unraveled his alibi and exposed the cold, calculated nature of his crime. Now, it was time for the justice system to take its course. In June 2015, after years of investigation and countless emotional moments for Simeonette's family, the trial began. The courtroom was tense, filled with a sense of anticipation as the prosecution laid out the details of the crime. Jonathan Crupi sat in the defendant's chair, his face cold and emotionless, a stark contrast to the grief and pain that permeated the room. His behavior throughout the trial was marked by a lack of remorse, a chilling detachment from the crime he had committed. His once calm demeanor, which had been so evident in the 911 call, persisted as he sat in the courtroom. He seemed almost indifferent to the gravity of the situation, an indifferent man facing the consequences of a brutal act he had meticulously planned. The prosecution, led by Assistant District Attorney Wanda de Oliveira, presented a detailed and compelling case. The evidence against Crupi was irrefutable. His lies had been exposed, his alibi shattered, and the DNA found at the crime scene pointed directly to him. The chilling search history on his devices, which had revealed his obsession with murder techniques, was used as a key piece of evidence, revealing the depth of his premeditation. The murder weapon found in the home was also a damning link, confirming that Crupi had been the one to carry out the brutal attack. The defense, on the other hand, tried to paint a different picture, claiming that Crupi had been under extreme stress and had acted out of anger in the heat of the moment. But the prosecution's case was airtight. Crupi's actions had been methodical, driven by a plan that had been months in the making. There was no evidence of a momentary lapse in judgment. This had been a calculated murder, a deliberate act of violence carried out by a man who had betrayed his wife in every possible way. Throughout the trial, Simeonette's family sat quietly in the courtroom, their hearts heavy with grief and disbelief. To them, the man sitting in the defendant's chair was the person who had taken their daughter, sister, and friend away from them in the most violent and senseless manner. The pain they felt could never be erased by a court ruling, no matter how just the verdict might be. They had lost a loved one, and no punishment could bring her back. As the trial progressed, the evidence continued to build, and it became increasingly clear that Jonathan Crupi would not be able to escape the consequences of his actions. The courtroom was filled with the tension of a long-anticipated resolution, and when it came time for the verdict, it was met with a sense of finality that reverberated through the room. In July 2015, Jonathan Crupi was found guilty of second-degree murder. The jury deliberated for just hours before delivering their verdict, and when the decision was announced, the weight of it hung heavy in the air. The courtroom was silent as the reality of the situation set in. Crupi had taken his wife's life, and now he would pay for that crime. The judge sentenced Crupi to the maximum penalty, 25 years to life in prison. There would be no leniency, no parole. The verdict was a stark reminder of the consequences of his actions, a fitting punishment for a man who had murdered his wife in cold blood. But for Simeonette's family, the pain of losing her would never be soothed by the verdict. No matter how long Crupi spent in prison, it could never replace the life they had lost. As Crupi was led away from the courtroom, the reality of his situation seemed to dawn on him, but only briefly. He had spent months spinning a web of lies, trying to cover up his crime, but now the truth had caught up with him. There would be no more opportunities to manipulate the situation, no more chances to escape the consequences. The life he had once known, one built on deceit and betrayal, had come to an end. In the months that followed, Simeonette's family tried to find a way to move forward. They had lost a beloved daughter, sister, and friend, and the pain of her death would never fully go away. There would be no closure, no healing, no real sense of peace. The empty space left by Simeonette's absence would forever linger, a constant reminder of the brutal act that had stolen her away from them. Yet, despite the profound grief and loss, there was a sense of justice. Jonathan Crupi had been held accountable for his actions. The truth had been revealed, and the system had worked as it was intended to, ensuring that the man who had taken Simeonette's life would face the consequences. But justice, as it often does in cases like this, felt hollow. It could never undo the damage that had been done. It could never bring Simeonette back. In the aftermath of the trial, the case of Jonathan Crupi and Simeonette Maupus Crupi became a reminder, a grim lesson in the fragility of trust, the devastating consequences of betrayal, and the reality that sometimes the person closest to you can be the one to destroy everything. It serves as a stark warning that not all relationships are what they seem, and sometimes the darkness lurking behind a facade can only be revealed through tragic and irreversible acts. While justice was served, the pain for Simeonette's family would never go away. It would remain a quiet presence in their lives, a reminder of the love they had lost. They would never forget the woman they had known, the woman who had been so full of life, and the man who had taken her away from them. The case now closed, left behind a legacy of grief and a stark reminder of the depths to which a person can fall when driven by lies, betrayal, and a thirst for control.